But I want to shift to I guess more specifics, because here in Europe we're fighting now. I would have called it a proxy war against Russia, but it's becoming increasingly a very direct war. And I thought it was interesting you mentioned Spengler before in the civilizational discourse, because he used to refer to the Russians as more barbaric and primitive, but when he did so, he did it in the context you said, that they were more youthful, and he actually saw it as being beneficial to reach out to the Russians to, I guess, regain some of Europe's vitality and youth. But there's no such sentiment today. It's more, of course, one could say there was a bit demeaning reference to them, but nonetheless, in that framework of civilizations taking the lifespan of a human being, the Russians were seen as being the youthful part. But today, in the Ukraine war, where do you see this going? Because I'm very perplexed by the mere information which is coming out. It seems so very much divorced from reality. So, for example, in the 1990s, the whole decade, we had the discussions about the dangers of expanding NATO without taking in Russia. Now it's all memory hold. It never happened. So where do you see this war actually going?
Yeah, so I think for the past year, the war has been over. And if you just look at the front lines, if you look at how the Russians are fighting this war as opposed to how the Ukrainians are fighting this war, the Russian soldiers are demonstrating energy, openness, and cohesion. What I mean by that is that they're constantly learning from their mistakes and adapting to the circumstances. So the Russians have mastered drone warfare for reconnaissance purposes. At first they were using these large battalion units against the Ukrainians, and they realized that they could be easily targeted and attacked by drones. So now it's like 2 or 3 reconnaissance infantry on motorcycles, and that's destroying Ukrainian defenses because the front lines are huge and the Ukrainians are not able to respond to such energy and innovation initiative among the Russian soldiers. And if you talk to these Russian soldiers, if you interview these Russian soldiers on the front lines, they will tell you this is a crusade. This is a crusade to save Russian civilization. This is a crusade to save the motherland. This is a crusade to destroy the Antichrist, which they believe is the corruption of Western civilization. So they're extremely energetic, they're extremely open, they're extremely cohesive. And then you go talk to these Ukrainian soldiers, and it's the complete opposite, right? Now they're dragging these 50-year-old men off the streets of Ukraine to fight this war that's completely pointless, hopeless, and lost. The desertion rates among the Ukrainian soldiers are just sky high, right? Like you're talking about hundreds of thousands of soldiers who are deserting. So this war is completely lost. And the reason why the Ukrainians have not admitted defeat is that it would be political suicide for the regime in Kiev to admit defeat, right? Because if Zelensky, after promising for the past 4 years that Russia is just a house of cards, that's going to decline, that will collapse because of Russian sanctions the very next day. You've been saying this for the past 4 years. You've won the social media war. I mean, if you just watch social media, the Ukrainians have been amazing. You can't tell your people the war is lost. You're going to get assassinated. And regardless of what happens, if you admit defeat, there'll be a revolution in Ukraine. So the Ukrainians are stuck where they are. They have to see this thing to the bitter end. Now, the Europeans are sponsoring the Ukrainians with the expectation that the Ukrainians will win this war. And look, this isn't really well said in the media, but NATO has been in this war ever since the beginning. Yes, it is Ukrainian manpower. It is Ukrainian soldiers on front lines, but it is NATO weaponry, NATO targeting, NATO surveillance, NATO special forces, NATO command and control, NATO financing. It's been everything from NATO. So NATO is sort of stuck as well in this war. It's sunk cost fallacy. It's like you go to a gambling house and you've lost $1 million. You can't leave because how do you tell your wife that you lost $1 million, right? So you're stuck where you are. So Ukraine's stuck, NATO is stuck, and this war is going to be resolved only by a military solution. I know there's a 3-point deal on the table right now. There's no way that Ukraine can say yes to this. There's no way that NATO can say yes to this. And so I think what's going to happen is the Russians are going to march all the way to Odessa. And once they take Odessa, this war is over, because Russia will have obtained all its strategic objectives. And by that point, NATO would have imploded by then.
I like the way you use the openness as a point of departure, because often in the West we have to subscribe to the idea that we are open because we're the liberal democracy, where Russia's authoritarian, so it's closed. But it seems one of our main problems in Europe is that exactly that we have become closed in terms of refusing to see reality as it is. That is, I agree that usually in a war, the invading forces versus defending forces, you will see advantage of the defending ones in terms of morale, because they're defending the homeland. They will have greater motivation as opposed to anyone who is just militarily opportunistic. But this has kind of been the assumption in the West, that the Ukrainians would fight and the Russians would simply flee because they would realize the moral corruption of their government, who was just trying to snatch some new territories. But all of this left NATO out of the equation, though. That is, and if we leave NATO out, because we can't say that we're involved, suddenly that undermines our ability to interpret the motivations of the Russians. As you say, they genuinely see this as a war for their own existence, and I would add, for a very good reason as well. But again, if we have to all conform to this narrative that it's just opportunism, they're just hungry for more territory, this is just the Russian DNA, all our analysis will then be wrong. And I'm wondering if you see the openness as part of the weakness we have, because it's not just one issue. I think a big crisis we have in the West is a crisis of lack of strategy. That is, we can't even interpret threats anymore. Threats entails assessing intentions and capabilities, but when you're obligated to hate your opponent, how can you possibly interpret their intentions and capabilities in an objective manner? I mean, in Europe, you can't even discuss the security concern of your opponents. I mean, come to this continent, try to explain, what do you think are the security concerns of China, Iran, Russia? You would, crucified. You would have your career destroyed. They come after you. It's incredible. How are you going to have sensible policies if you can't actually talk about your opponents in a way that actually humanizes them?
Look, I went to school at Yale, and this was like the late 90s. And Yale College, America at that point, was a very open, dynamic society where you were welcome to criticize everyone and everything. And I said to myself, you know what? If a society is so open, there's no way it could ever decline. Fast forward to 2016, right? 2016, you had Brexit, you had the election of Donald Trump. And at this point, if you're part of the elite, now's a good time to reflect and appreciate the world isn't what you think it is. And to appreciate that there's some serious problems in society that need to be addressed, especially wealth inequality, especially corruption, especially debt among the poor. And so now's a good time to reset your society. Instead, the elite chose to turtle up and create their own bubble and just ignore all criticism. And this was made worse during COVID, and this became extremely insular. The elite became extremely insular after the Russians invaded Ukraine, because the Russians invading Ukraine was a paradigm shift for the Russian elite, because they couldn't imagine like anyone could possibly challenge their empire, right? I mean, the Russians were this gas station with nuclear weapons, and they were poor, backward, barbarian people that survived on Western generosity. And their elite was extremely corrupt. So how could they dare possibly challenge us? So the Russian invasion was a major shot in the face of the elite. I mean, it sort of popped their bubble. But then, like, you know what? We'll just double down. We'll just continue believing our silly beliefs, even though they make no sense, and we'll believe that Ukraine will win this war. And so we've reached a point where, unfortunately, the biggest problem in the Western world is the arrogance, the insularity, and the close-mindedness of the elite. And the elite now has absolutely no strategic foresight. Not only will they refuse to consider the strategic considerations of Russia, Iran, and China, as you say, but they also refuse to admit that they could be at fault for what happened, right? They absolutely refuse to accept that NATO expansionism provoked the Russians into this war, and they have absolutely no plans for moving forward. You ask them, like, if Ukraine loses this war, what are you going to do? And they're like, they're not going to lose this war. Okay, well, what's going to happen if America forces you to send troops to Ukraine? Like, they have actually no idea what to do. So you have this Western elite that has put their heads in the sand. They collectively put their heads in the sand, and they're praying the sky doesn't fall on them. But the sky is going to fall on them.
Yeah, no, well, again, this is I've never seen anything like this. People talked about propaganda during the invasion of Iraq. I remember that well, and it pales in comparison. I mean, this media coverage of Russians sending meat waves, and all of this is easy to disprove. But that's my point. If you had an open society where you could disprove, it would be one thing. But even if you look through the whole history of the conflict, that is from the coup, it's very easy to prove, to come up with the evidence that it was a coup, that there was a toppling, that, and again, within the first 24 hours of the coup, the US and others began to seize control over the intelligence agencies, government, economy of Ukraine, to use it as a tool against the Russians. But even when you have the facts, which can't be disputed, I noticed we've gone to a different level now. Now they say, well, you're supporting the Russian narratives. So it's no longer if it's true or not. It's just that story seems to give legitimacy to the Russians, and it delegitimizes us. So by merely presenting, irrespective of it being correct, it's just the narratives. This is the problem. You should be in the trenches with us, and then you avoid, just say ABC. This is all you have to do. Even the sanctions, this is something that also perplexed me, because since 2014, that was my main research focus. That is Russia diversifying its economy, looking towards the east, making itself more bulletproof to sanctions. So I made the point immediately as these sanctions came, they can never succeed. Russia's prepared for this. It's like, oh, but this is, you're undermining trust, in the sanctions. It's all a socially constructed phenomenon. If we believe the sanctions work, people will support them, and then eventually Russia will be exhausted. So reality is, it's not part of the discussion anymore. It's just a battle of narratives, it seems.
Look, I mean, the reality is that Western elite has absolutely no plan moving forward. They have absolutely no imagination. They are not able to reflect and innovate. Okay, so they imposed sanctions on Russia in 2020 because they imposed sanctions on Russia in 2014. And Trump comes in office, and at this point, everyone knows sanctions are not going to work. In fact, the Russian economy is doing quite well. So Russia has so many workarounds against these Western sanctions, and Trump basically said to Putin, if you don't cooperate with me, I'm going to impose sanctions on you. So we've reached a point where the entire Western world lives in their own bubble, far removed from reality. Another issue that is going to tear Western Europe apart is immigration. This war in Ukraine is not going well, but look, this immigration issue, it's going to tear Western society apart. You look at what's happening in France, in the UK. I mean, you have these race riots going on, and you have to ask yourself how much longer society can stay together now that you have so much immigration, you have so much conflict within these nation states. So unfortunately, I think that looking forward, I think that what's going to happen is that the Western world, especially NATO, is going to commit more in Ukraine, and this is going to cause civil wars within the societies, and they're unable to see what is bleeding obvious to everyone else.
Well, if we shift towards another part of the world, because these are indeed turbulent times to a large extent by the exhaustion of the West, but also the rise of new centers of power. And China, of course, is one that exudes a lot of energy at the moment. It's, anyone who goes there can almost feel it in the air. But these are, for this reason, turbulent, though. I mean, one would think that a clash between these two giants, China and the US, to come in different forms. Indeed, it is in terms of an economic war, but if it's not winning through on the American side, will they go into a military option, or how do you see the U.S.-China rivalry playing out?
Yeah, so I have a very different take on the U.S.-China rivalry than other analysts, okay? I believe that Russia, Iran are both revisionist powers in that they have been isolated, they've been ostracized by the global economy controlled by the United States and its allies. But China is very much a status quo power in that it's benefited tremendously these past 40 years from globalization, especially trade with the United States. And you could also argue the United States economies and the Chinese economies are codependent, meaning what happens is that China is taking all its excess cheap labor and exporting to the United States. In return, the United States gives China US dollars. So what's happening is that basically China is basically supporting or propping up the US dollar, which everyone knows is a Ponzi scheme. And the United States, in return, is transferring technology to China and helping China become wealthier and also opening its vast consumer market to Chinese consumer goods and therefore giving Chinese millions and millions of employment opportunities. So I think that China and the United States will eventually achieve a rapprochement, and we're already seeing that because President Xi and President Trump did meet in South Korea, and the meeting went very quarterly. It was not a great meeting, but Trump thought it went really well. And we should expect more meetings in the coming year. And I think that what will happen is a rapprochement between China and the United States because they benefit more from working together than they do from fighting together. These two economies are basically interdependent and they're intertwined, right? Because America's been talking for the past 10 years about onshoring its manufacturing. And it hasn't worked out because the American economy cannot sustain the cost of onshoring the manufacturing, and all these billion-dollar projects that have been emphasized, highlighted, have not turned out really well. So China is basically irreplaceable in terms of providing cheap manufacturing to the United States. So I think the United States and China will the friendship will improve over time.
Well, it does seem that a lot of the hostility coming towards China from the US is, based on the idea that they can't live side by side by a powerful China. In other words, it looks as if it's something that undermines the US hegemon as opposed to undermining the US itself. I don't know. I get the impression that, the US can't really restore its former hegemony. That is, the 1990s not coming back. And I think if there was rational discussions, more of it in the US, and actually there are more and more voices suggesting that a settlement could be found with China, because if the US would accept China, it doesn't have to prevent its rise. The US would actually have some benefits to be, one among equals in a multipolar system. It could reduce its foreign exposure, could stop bleeding so many resources, can get its economic house in order, stabilize society, economy. But of course, states do not always act rational when they're in decline. That's usually where my pessimism comes from. But from the rational perspective, the one would think that the US, given that they can't restore hegemony, that it could stabilize under a multipolar system, that there would be some room there for harmony. But my last question is, though, on, again, the two Eurasian giants. The big thing that no one seemed to predict was that, China and Russia would find common ground. Indeed, their economies are quite, mutually complementary. Unlike between Europe and Russia, there's no Ukraine in between that can be used as a proxy to decouple. Should we be surprised that if this partnership I guess is sustains over time?
Yeah, I am not that optimistic about the U.S. I'm not that optimistic about the Russia-China relationship because I think there are some geopolitical questions that need to be resolved. Okay, so one flashpoint that comes to mind is Kazakhstan. So ever since the 1980s, China has been heavily investing heavily in Kazakhstan because, Kazakhstan is such a pivot point for the Belt and Road Initiative. Everything basically has to pass through Kazakhstan in order to reach the Middle East and to Europe. So China has been spending a lot of resources trying to co-opt the Kazakhstan elite. It's invested heavily in Kazakhstan. And what's happened these past few years is that Kazakhstan has develop a much more pro-Russian attitude. You basically had a change in the guard in Kazakhstan. And so the Kazakhstan government is leaning more towards Russia. So my point is, like, I understand that people see Iran, Russia, and China forming this Eurasian bloc that can negate American naval power. And if that were to happen, then the Eurasian continent would prosper. But we have to remember that geography and history are pretty persistent. And Russia, China, Iran have had long histories of conflict, long histories of geographical and geopolitical tension. So I don't know how easily these conflicts can be resolved. So I know that China is very heavily invested in the Belt and Road Initiative, but Russia has its North-South corridor. Iran has its own trade route programs. So the question then is, okay, if these three nations were to come together and work together, who would be the top dog? Whose currency would be the universal currency? And can all these territorial disputes that have been persistent for the past few centuries, can they be resolved through negotiations? So I think there are some serious geopolitical issues that need to be resolved before these nations can work peacefully together.
Yeah, because what one often hears from China and Russia is that they're not allies, they're more than allies, because an ally would essentially be country A and B cooperating against country C. In other words, the argument is therefore that they're not dependent on collectively balancing the US. But this is what I was wondering. Do you see, again, the United States, I think everyone recognizes that at least the US attempting to impose its primacy has brought together these countries. But if the US would end this, its aspirations to restore hegemony, and they wouldn't no longer require this collective balancing, do you think that a lot of these problems or challenges between the Chinese, Russians, Iranians would then begin to surface more if the US is taken out of the equation?
Okay, so if I were a Chinese geopolitical strategist, I'm not, okay, but I'm saying if I work with the government, what I would say is that, objectively speaking, it's probably better for China that the US remains in Southeast Asia than if it were to leave. The reason why is, let's imagine the US leaves, okay? Well, how would Japan respond? How would India respond? How would Russia respond? How would South Korea respond? How would North Korea respond? Okay, so there are these different geopolitical actors in my region, and I really have problems anticipating how they behave. Japan has been historically very aggressive because they are a naval power without much land resources. People don't appreciate this, but the great naval power in Southeast Asia is not the United States. It's not even China. It is actually Japan. So if we took out air power, okay, Japanese Navy would be the dominant naval power in Southeast Asia, and the reason why is they have to be. Remember, Japan is an isolated island with very little resources, so they need to be able to exert naval hegemony throughout the Southeast Asia, right? So during World War II, that's something called the Greater Japan Co-Prosperity Sphere. So Japan is very much an aggressive maritime power. Then you look at South Korea, which has always had these historical animosities against Japan and against China for being colonized by these two great powers. You look at Vietnam, you look at India. So if I'm a geopolitical analyst, I'm like, you know what? I'm happy with the United States being where it is because at least it maintains the status quo. And I'm happy with the status quo because I don't have to deal with Japan, South Korea, Russia, and India. So I'm saying this as a geopolitical analyst working in China. I'm just saying I prefer things to be much more predictable, much more stable, much more continuous. And that means having the United States stay where it is.
You know, I think that's an excellent point. One should be careful what one wishes for. That is, if the US would leave East Asia, I think there would be a good chance that Japan would then cross the threshold of developing, for example, nuclear weapons if they have to maintain their own deterrent. And indeed, one can only look towards Europe. The Trump administration has questioned its interest and priority of maintaining its presence in Europe. And the response, I mean, look at Germany, who used to be a peaceful country that had learned from World War II. Now it's becoming one of the most militaristic. They want to join in on nuclear sharing. They want to have the biggest army in Europe. I mean, they would like to be on the front of confronting Russia. I mean, this is not even recognizable of the Germany of only 4 or 5 years ago. So I do think if the US would pull down from East Asia, that the consequences might not be in China's favor either. So I think that's a very valid point to make. Before we go, though, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, so one thing that I'm looking very closely at, and I think your viewers might be interested in as well, is the rise of Pax Judaica. So what I'm watching is how a lot of nations believe that Pax Judaica may be in their best interest, and therefore they're promoting the rise of Pax Judaica. So the United States promoting the rise of Pax Judaica, that's understandable. But if I'm Russia, Israel would be a very good trading partner. Because, eventually Russia's going to win this war in Ukraine. It's going to control the Donbass, and therefore it's going to be able to control about 1/3 of the world's carbohydrates. Where's my market? My market is in Africa. My market is in the Middle East. And so Israel would be the perfect entry point into these markets, right? So if I'm Russia, I think that Pax Judaica works to my benefit. If I'm China, Pax Judaica works to my benefit as well. Because Pax Judaica means that Israel would take control over Syria, Iraq, Egypt, possibly Libya. And as such, Israel would need a lot of infrastructure spending. It would need a lot of infrastructure projects. It would also need to spend a lot of money on data centers, on artificial intelligence, and create this massive surveillance state to watch over the Greater Israel project of Pax Judaica. So I think like the big surprise over the next 5 to 10 years is the rise of Pax Judaica. And that's something I'm watching very closely right now.
But wouldn't the counter argument be, though, that Israel has begun to exhaust itself in terms of overextending its military? The economy has well been harmed by a lot of the young people leaving. It's fueling a big political crisis now. And, it seems that at the heart of it, there's also a deeper problem. That is the entire ethos of what Israel should represent is being questioned, if not undermined. Of course, you can also add then the neighbors becoming the leadership across the Arab states, and even Turkey can have now more challenges in terms of explaining why they're not taking a more hostile approach to Israel. Given that also the US is in relative decline and other as its main protector, usually one hears the opposite argument, though, that Israel is finished, essentially.
Right.
How would you respond to that?
So I think the nation of Israel and Pax Judaica are not the same thing. Okay, the nation of Israel is very much a Zionist project. I think Pax Judaica would be a project of transnational capital or finance. So let's just say I have $1 billion and I need to go invest it somewhere. I don't want to invest in the United States because the United States is $38 trillion in debt. It is divided, and it seems to be on the very brink of civil war. So it's kind of silly for me to put $1 billion in the United States. So where do I put this money? Well, the only place where I can put this money and see it grow over time is Israel. And the reason why is the entire Middle East. You look at Libya, you look at Iraq, Syria. It's destroyed, but that offers the opportunity for growth, right? So if I'm capital, I'm only interested in growth in return on investment. So and I think like it's every wealthy person thinks like that. I think like if I had $1 billion in the bank, I had to put my money somewhere. I would put it in Israel, and not only that, but I would do my hardest. I would work very hard to ensure that Israel wins out. And as you say, maybe there's something that the Israelis themselves don't want, but often history is decided by those with power as opposed to the people themselves.
That's a very interesting perspective. I hadn't looked at it from that angle. So yeah, before you go, where can people find you and follow your work?
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel, Predictive History, where I upload my lectures on history. So I'm basically just trying to analyze what happened before and try to figure out what it means for the present. Okay, so I've done a lot of analysis of Middle Eastern history, and I believe that Pax Judaica is the future. I think that Israel will become the dominant power in the Middle East. So if you want to understand my reasoning, my analysis, definitely check out my YouTube channel where I go into the history of the Middle East. I also have a Substack, also called Predictive History, where you can subscribe. Most of our articles are free. So if you're interested in my geopolitical analysis, I would highly recommend it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we should have devoted more time to the Middle East, but maybe next time. So thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
大家好，我是主播周玉琴。很多的朋友告诉我们，选择原版的太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，它添加有羽衣甘蓝，健康再加分。而有睡眠困扰的朋友们，赶快选择蓝色包装这一款晚安加强版，绝对是更有感。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good， 请上快点购为健康下单，而且要记得输入推荐代码，有额外的折扣优惠。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌基础版、晚安加强版，新包装改版，内容不变，抽取更方便。要吃就吃最好的。